Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever this might find you. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Security and Privacy, What Nonprofits Need to Know. I'm Nicole Jones, Director of Communications here at TechSoup, and I'll be your host. All right, so we've got some great content to cover today, but before we do that, let's just cover a little bit of housekeeping using ReadyTalk. So if you have any questions throughout today's webinar, you can ask them in the chat box. And note that all lines are muted, and if at any point you lose internet connection, you can reconnect using the link emailed to you. We've got a whole slew of webinars, both upcoming and past, and you can learn more about them at the TechSoup website, techsoup.org/community/events-webinars. And you'll also receive an email with this presentation recording and links. And another way to connect with us is on Twitter at TechSoup, and you can use the hashtag #TSWebinars. All right, so this webinar is brought to you by TechSoup, a global network bridging tech solutions and services for good. Over 1.1 million nonprofits in 236 countries and territories have benefited from TechSoup and recognize TechSoup as their unique resource partner. And this is made possible with the support of more than 100 corporate donors and providers of software, hardware, and services who have chosen the TechSoup platform to create and grow impactful in-kind donation programs. You can learn more about all of our great offerings for change makers like yourself by visiting our nonprofit tech marketplace at techsoup.org/get-product-donations. And since today's webinar is all about security and privacy, it's a great opportunity to share about the Symantec Security for Nonprofits program at TechSoup. You can check out all these offers at techsoup.org/Symantec-catalog. But TechSoup is much more than just a tech marketplace for getting great deals on software and hardware for your nonprofit. We also offer online and offline communities to foster collaboration and peer learning opportunities, in addition to useful tech resources and tips through TechSoup's free blogs, webinars, forums, and articles. That, plus our Apps for Good division, where we collaborate with experts to create and curate relevant solutions that help communities around the world. All right, and now for the exciting part, our introductions for who is joining us on today's webinar. So we're joined by two presenters from Symantec, Michael Standard, he is Senior Corporate Counsel, and Kirsten McMullen, Global Privacy Compliance Program Manager. And they're joined by me, your host, Nicole Jones, and our fantastic Communications Project Coordinator, Zareen Kazi, who will be helping answer your questions along the way. And with that, I'm pleased to hand it on over to Michael and Kirsten. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Nicole, and thanks for having us, and thanks everybody for joining. So I won't spend too much time on the intros. We actually have quite a bit of material to get through, but now is a great time to go grab that last cup of coffee. So I am Corporate Counsel on Symantec's Global Privacy team. Kirsten McMullen is joining me. She's recently joined our team, but has great privacy and data security background and also some nonprofit background. So what we're going to go through today is titled Do's, Don'ts, and Why It Matters. And we're going to start with sort of the why it matters part and try to keep the, the intro comments brief. We're going to be going through a lot of material. There will be some kind of dense checklists and suggested do's and don'ts at the end. So we may skip around a little bit, and I'm going to take it easy on you guys and not read through every slide. I know you don't need that, but this material is made available to you, so I really recommend that as we cover some concepts, focus on the concepts and then obviously use this material to your benefit and creating different checklists and questionnaires you may use in your organization. So a little bit of my history. I do work for Symantec, obviously a very large global corporation. I've worked for other large global corporations, but I've also worked for small companies, companies as small as 120 employees. So again, we want to go through some concepts and help you guys right-size your program. And we realize that not everyone has the budget and resources. And so you can go as high-tech or low-tech with some of these suggestions as you like. So we're going to start with the why it matters piece. For nonprofits, brand trust and messaging matter the most. You lose trust and you lose your message, you lose your audience, you lose your constituents. So we want to start with real-world examples of some privacy and security missteps and how you may guard against them. This helps with context, and it also helps provide some context from the material as we go through it. And also did want to point out we're not picking on these particular organizations. These are just examples of real-world incidents and basically the fact that it can happen to any of us if we let our guard down. And so this slide here is obviously the headlines. The goal of each and every one of you should be not to be in these headlines or headlines like these. So our first example is actually a nonprofit. Save the Children was hacked by malicious scammers creating false invoices. The organization was tricked into transferring nearly $1 million to a fake business entity in Japan. And with some research, it appears that the information could not be recovered, or the money could not be recovered. And so how do you guard against things like this? You're going to hear probably over and over in this conversation just training and awareness. The criminal scams are becoming much more sophisticated, and clearly nonprofits are not off limits. So again, it's a theme that we're going to hit on multiple times, training and awareness. So instead of trust but verify, we're going to preach don't trust and double verify. So a situation like this, if you receive email invoices and you're not absolutely sure of their source and their authenticity, have methods and procedures in place to double check these. The next is a very similar, only it had much more significant impact, basically, and it also shows the level of sophistication of the different criminals and bad actors out there. We had an individual or a bad actor that basically spoofed not only a change in the accounts payable, but also a letter that appeared to come from a trusted source. But it appears that all of this was done over electronic means. So again, if you just have simple security checklists, don't rely on everything electronic, and just understand and be aware how sophisticated some of these folks are. If you think about it, if you just simply have a computer and a lot of time, you can create some very convincing forgeries. And I deal with these in my personal life, and I've seen them in my professional life. So training and awareness, just be advised. Here's probably one of my favorite examples of a privacy security misstep, because this really just goes to show you that this can happen to any of us. This is an organization that simply at the end of its copier lease turned in the copiers. What it failed to do and what it failed to realize were that the copiers had hard copy drives on them where data was stored, and they basically turned in personal data at the end of the copier lease. And so this is a case where if you have a checklist, perhaps an entire data lifecycle checklist, a simple checklist might have avoided this. Also having the right parties involved in reviewing your business practices. So whereas, even in my position, I may not have known of the risk to data in simply returning copiers. But if you have the right folks from IT and they're trained to know what to look for, I think this is a simple issue that could have been avoided. And then finally, this could be the subject, this example, FTC versus errands. This could be the subject of a day-long seminar. To get to what happened, basically the Aaron's rent-to-own franchise rented out computers to individuals. Those computers were apparently loaded down with spyware. The spyware captured screenshots of confidential and personal information, including images. The cost of this to Aaron's was at least $25 million to settle with the California Attorney General's office, and I really don't have follow-up on the additional cost to Aaron's, but you can imagine the brand hit as well. I think, to me, this is a perfect example of how a privacy program, even in a very simple form, could have avoided this. What happened here was basically the parent company blamed the franchisees blamed the vendor. And the vendor basically took a lot of heat, but it said instead it's Aaron's brand up front. So how could you have avoided this in the first place? I think a very simple privacy by design program, both at the corporate level and then passed down to the franchisees. Some very basic checklists of questions to ask. And this is another topic that I think that we can't overlook, and that's vendor privacy security due diligence. And so you have the corporate office blaming the franchisees, blaming the vendor. So these programs, and this is another topic that we'll cover as we go through these slides with suggestions, but everything needs to be pushed down even to the vendor level. And I think that's a blind spot for a lot of companies. So those are the sort of the wall of shame, if you will, of privacy and security missteps. So now we wanted to get to kind of an understanding of where you think the maturity of your privacy program is. Hopefully you should be seeing Kirsten, keep me honest here. Hopefully everyone is seeing the survey.
Yep, everybody should be seeing the survey, and you can pick from the limited choices as to what best describes your organization. I can see responses are coming in rapidly.
Yeah. So, and again, as we tally up the responses here, it looks like a lot of them are really settling down towards the informal with some documentation and then more or less ad hoc. And again, that's why you're here, and it's not shocking. What we hope to provide you are some suggestions, again, kind of high-level principles and approaches you can take. And your solutions can certainly be low-tech. I said written checklists, methods, and procedures that you push out in the organization. I think the biggest is training and awareness, and we'll cover that a little bit later. So the responses, it looks like everybody is clicked in here. So out of the responses, 21 documented and regularly reviewed, 32 documented but not reviewed, and then 144 are either informal or ad hoc. Again, that's really not that surprising. So we will hopefully get to some material that will help you go from ad hoc to at least some formal policies and procedures. So you often hear of security and privacy being mentioned in the same breath, and in fact it's in my title. But I rely heavily on my colleagues that focus on security. And security, I think the difference how I view these, security is a much broader mandate. Security is focused on all confidential and sensitive data, not just personal data. Where I work most closely with my security colleagues are in a number of different areas. And I think this is, if you, and hopefully you do have designated security personnel who help you with information security, these are the areas where I think that your privacy professionals or your privacy ambassadors and your security professionals should be looking to partner the most. One is just project and product assessments. Be it a formal or informal privacy by design, a privacy questionnaire, you really should be working hand in hand with your information security colleagues. The second, and again I can't stress this enough, is you really need to look at your vendors and your partners and your service providers. Your program is only as good, basically as its weakest point. And if you're not looking at your vendors and your service providers, then that could be an incredible gap in your privacy and security program. So I would partner up with your information security colleagues for vendor and partner assessment. Another area is obviously the data retention, data handling, and lifecycle management. That is a much broader mandate, typically of most security organizations, and you want to address privacy within that as a subset. And I think draw upon your colleagues, obviously their experience in data handling, and just make sure that you have accounted for the personal data. And then obviously in any type of, yes?
I just wanted to ask, can you give a quick definition of privacy by design? You've mentioned it a couple of times here, but it may not be a term that everyone's familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely. And a good question, and I don't want to jump ahead. Privacy by design has been a concept in place for probably a couple of decades, and it really is just a formal program of implementing privacy into the very beginning of your product design or your service design or even any new projects that handle personal data. It's a checklist from beginning to end to make sure that privacy is a key component. So we typically will get involved with initial product roadmaps at the very start. We will point out some privacy concerns and red flags we see. We will follow the process all the way through to make sure that it's privacy friendly. Let's take a product, for example. And we'll take that review, that privacy by design process, all the way through the end of the data lifecycle. So how long are we storing data? Who is responsible for securely deleting data when it's no longer needed? And so when I refer to a privacy by design program, again, it can be as simple or as complex as your organization warrants. It can be a checklist. There are a lot of great tools out there that automate a privacy by design program. I don't want to pitch any particular ones, but this is a market that is growing and a lot of companies have jumped into it. So, and we'll cover more about privacy by design and some of the fair information practices later on. So again, where I work with the security organization, obviously, anytime there's incident detection and response, meaning there has been some sort of threat to the security of your data, be it personal data or confidential data, I will partner many times with our security organization. And then finally, testing and audit. So no matter what your controls, you should try to create, again, a right-size approach to testing and confirming that you're actually following them. And so I think in these 5 areas is where I partner most closely with my security colleagues. And again, I think final point is take the time here to really perform due diligence and security due diligence on your vendors. Moving on. I'm not going to read through this slide. I'll spare you just reading through all this. But again, these are areas where privacy and security both kind of have their own mandates and areas where they mix. It really is going into more examples of the respective roles. Again, not all corporations have separate privacy and security organizations. I've seen many smaller organizations where privacy is placed under the role of the chief security officer or the equivalent. And there's nothing wrong with that. Again, in some organizations, it just does not make sense to have 2 functions, 2 separate functions. For larger companies, it does make sense. The reason being, you want 2 different organizations equally focused on these subject matter areas. It's important to right-size the approach for your organization. And like I said, I have seen smaller organizations combine these, and there's just absolutely nothing wrong with it. So here's, I didn't want to get into too many definitions and dive into the weeds on legal terms. But I think this is one of the most important, is obviously what is personal data. And the reason that I wanted to stress this here is that it's still one of the most common misunderstandings that I see, even in our organization. I think the reason for that is that historically in the U.S., the personal data breach notification laws, which are on the state level, they deal with PII, or personally identifiable information, which is a small subset, of typically sensitive financial data. I probably don't have to tell this audience that the definition of personal data that's found in the GDPR, for example, the definition that is coming in CCPA is so much broader than the simple old PII definition. So I think it's very important when you're doing assessments in your training, in your awareness with your organization, to make sure that this is the #1 thing that folks need to understand. Because you can't do a privacy assessment if your individuals are not giving you, full information on what personal data is actually being processed. If they are still using the old PII or personally identifiable information definitions, you may not be getting the full picture. Now, with that being said, It does not mean that all personal data is equally sensitive or risky. I think it's not unusual to determine protections and controls based on the risk profile of the data. So a simple IP address obviously is not going to be as sensitive as a social security number. They're both personal data, but obviously the controls and protections may differ. So moving on. So again, I'm going to spare you reading through each of these. The fair information practice principles. What and I've provided a footnote to an example here. You'll hear them referred to as the FIPPs, but again, that's fair information practice principles. For example, the version of the FIPPs really forms the basis for Canada's privacy law, FIPPs. And I would say these principles form the backbone of virtually every global personal data protection law. Transparency, choice, data minimization, information review. So how can you use the FIPPs, basically? Your program, be it an informal privacy by design program, a checklist of privacy issues, a training program. I think if you just go out and research, again, there are very different versions of these same principles. You'll find them online, you'll find them in public sources, and I've given you the link to FIPPs here. That is a schedule actually at the very end of the Canadian law that outlines the privacy principles. If you create your program around these principles and you incorporate these into your checklist, your questionnaires, you are going to account for probably 90% of what the legal and regulatory requirement or legal and regulatory environment requires. So I point these out again as a simple resource for you to use in crafting your privacy program. So I have to start this next slide, the top 3 threats to nonprofits, with somewhat of a disclaimer. I consider these the top 3 threats to virtually all private companies based on my experience. And the threats are organizational, which is just a lack of training and awareness, maybe poor security practices, things like that. Obviously bad actors. At the beginning we showed you, some examples of how bad actors can take advantage of gaps and maybe blind spots. And I just can't tell you how sophisticated some of these are getting. And I'm seeing this in my own personal life. I was in the market for a used car, and it is scary out there looking for something, a large purchase online. How many bad actors and just pop-up phishing sites there are. And then again, I mentioned the vendors, not as an attack on your service providers or vendors, but mainly just to stress that this is a blind spot that most people don't consider. So how can you counter these top threats? I think for the organizational threats, having some basic privacy methods and procedures. I've mentioned several times, checklists maybe based on the FIPPs or the Fair Information Practice Principles. A formal privacy by design program, and again, formal may simply mean prior to any new project you go through a questionnaire, and we have some samples later on in the programs. And then obviously an audited security program. I think you do need to at least annually check to make sure that you're following the practices that you're supposed to have in place. Training and awareness, again, can't say enough about this. This obviously is important for the organizational issues as well as for catching the bad actors. And then again, there's some simple vendor assessments and questionnaires. What I do see quite often are the click to accept agreements. So you see a tool out there that you might want to use, and you just simply click to accept their terms as is. Without checking what their personal data processing practices are, checking their policies, you could have just opened up a huge blind spot for your organization. So I really do encourage you to check out your vendors. So moving through some of the most common exploits, again, I know I'm using some jargon here, spoofing, phishing, malware. These slides will provide you more information on what that encompasses. And again, I'll let you go back and read these, but these are just examples of, again, some of the methods used by the bad actors out there. So let's get into some of the do's and don'ts. And I'll start with, these are do's and don'ts to counter your privacy risks. And I say to counter your risk, but also just to do it right. No matter what size of the organization, you want to assess your risks. Everyone is different. Where do you feel like you're most exposed to bad actors? Where do you feel like you need the most training for your internal organization? Whether you take advantage of some free training and kind of generic training, I think it's important to train your teams on privacy and security.
I'll just add in there that training doesn't have to be super formal or purchased from an outside source. A lot of people aren't even aware of what personal information is, the slide that Michael covered earlier, and simply raising the awareness of your team to what is personal and the risks of that going into the wrong hands for your organization. Just that simple. A weekly email with a security tip can make a huge difference in people's conscious awareness of privacy and security issues in your organization. Sorry, I had to give a shout out to privacy training. I'm a big fan.
No, absolutely, and it's a good point. If you have a company newsletter, include a special place in that newsletter for just privacy and security issues, because I think they're that important. And then I think nonprofits actually can be more vulnerable to bad actors because you're so, I think everyone is so committed to their mission that depending on how sophisticated the bad actors are and how they try to play on that mission, you really have to be careful about that. Anyway, implementing best practices, it really doesn't take a lot. You don't need an ultra formal security program. Change your passwords. Never go with your original passwords that are on your equipment. Encrypt where possible. There are a lot of solutions out there that are very affordable to make sure that your data is secure. I have to say the first dozen privacy security incidents I ever managed were simply lost laptops that were unencrypted. I would hope that we're technologically past that point, but I'm going to stress it here, and maybe we're not. Again, don't want to go over this too many times. Assess your vendors, ask questions. I would implement some sort of privacy by design program. This is really going to, I think it's going to stress and it's going to bring out maybe where some of your weaknesses are. If you're asking the questions, I think you may find out some things that you didn't expect. Account for employee data. GDPR and some of the GDPR is the EU's General Data Protection Regulation that went into effect last May. So it's pretty much what everybody in the privacy world has been working towards. And now we have CCPA, or the California Consumer Privacy Act, coming up, and we'll list some of those. But GDPR does not differentiate among consumer or employee data. It's a personal data regulation. A lot of the U.S. laws are focused on consumer data, and so they won't necessarily stress employee data. But I think from a best practices perspective, take care of those that are helping you with your mission, and include formal protections for employee data. What not to do. Some of these are self-evident. Don't ignore your risk. I'm kind of the school that, if it can happen, it very well may happen. So be prepared. You probably will see phishing attacks. Again, fake emails. The old Nigerian scam that's been famous throughout internet lore is now gone. It's much more sophisticated. Do not keep more data than you need for longer than you need. This is very, very common for, you have the mindset, well, we might need this someday. Well, what data do you keep? Oh, we keep everything. This just creates a higher risk for accidental loss of data or exposure, and it creates a much richer target for bad actors to go after. So have some data handling and deletion procedures in place. Again, don't use your default passwords that come with your devices. have a policy where password changes are required, say every 90 days. Don't ignore your own privacy policies. I do know in working for smaller companies, it's very easy to go grab a privacy policy off somebody else's website and make it your own. That's the history of a lot of websites. But it's really worse, I think it's worse to have a policy that you don't follow versus customizing yours and making sure that it's accurate. Again, I want to point, don't ignore your employee data. Just because it may not be, an issue that is addressed, for example, in the California Consumer Act, you need to consider whether you should have, formal written policies and procedures around your employee data. So here's where we get to the longer lists, and I really don't want to go over these and read them to you. Implementing the do's and don'ts, establish a privacy program. Again, I think what's important for you is to assess your organization, figure out what works for your business, figure out what works for your mission, where are your gaps, and where do you think your weaknesses and your blind spots are. As you go through these, I do want to stress that there are some automated tools that can make this a lot easier. They may be affordable. There may be some programs out there for nonprofits, but I would look into some of the automated tools. And in particular, I want to point out data mapping. I think this is one of the biggest challenges for organizations of all sizes. Really is understanding, how is your personal data coming into the organization? Who all has access to it? Who are you sharing it with? Where does it reside? Is it in the cloud? Are you keeping it on premises in your own servers? But data mapping is a huge challenge to organizations, and I think it's very important, obviously, to know where your data is. And I would certainly look into some of the automated solutions that make that a lot easier. Again, identifying threats, establishing security policies and controls, establish compliance capabilities. I think audit and verification is also probably one of the most overlooked. Certainly not in an organization as large as Symantec. We have, we're constantly being tested, audited, and our policies and procedures are being verified. But I know working for smaller companies that typically may not be practical. But I certainly would stress maybe certainly a once a year, making sure that what you've established in your organization is being followed, and then obviously awareness and training. So here's just a sample questionnaire. We do have, I focus primarily on consumer products. So obviously a consumer focus is going to be different than an enterprise focus. It's going to be different than maybe a service provider versus a product. So again, we've tried to give you basic concepts and questions, and hope that you go back and use this material to fit it to your organization. And as far as how you implement them in your organization, I think again, following a privacy by design approach, which is what is the earliest possible stage, and there's a lot of reasons for that. You want to raise the red flags early, so that you don't expend time, resources, money getting down the road on a project only to realize that there is a privacy red flag that you could have spotted very, very early on. And so that's really at one of the concepts at the heart of privacy by design, is really getting in at the start. So here's some possible questions you can ask. And again, here's some sample questions for a vendor assessment. I will let you go through these on your own time. And then we did not want to make this a, get in the weeds and discuss all the different privacy laws out there. First, many of them may not be applicable to you as nonprofits. Second, and I think the headline says it all, can anyone be 100% compliant? I'm not going to sit here today and say that we're not 100% compliant with all privacy laws. I am going to say it's a challenge in the business when you are a global corporation to be in compliance with all of these different laws. for example, again, Europeans' General Data Protection Act or GDPR, they recognize, and I think the Europeans are afraid of what happens to data once it is transferred from Europe to the US. And so they try to protect that data through what are called standard contractual clauses. And those are clauses that really travel with the data and carry the concepts of European law only through contract agreements. And they require these before you transfer law or data outside of the GDPR. And so I only use this as an example of how the different countries and states are really trying to make their data protection ideas, the laws of the land, how they try to export them beyond the borders. So it is very difficult to stand up and say, I'm betting my company that I'm 100% compliant with everything across the globe. I think it's important for you guys to follow these developments, again, recognizing they may not be directly applicable to you, but also, but basically to understand what are the expectations of your target audiences. So even though these laws may not be directly applicable, these laws do influence the expectations of the individuals you deal with. You have a much different definition, for example, of sensitive personal data in Europe than you do in the US. And so I think it's important to understand the basics of all these different laws and the emergence of things like the CCPA in the US. The California Consumer Privacy Act is just the start. As we've seen with the state breach notification laws, I think this is clearly going to spread. And then the question is the US Congress functional enough to pass a federal law that will cover basically all commerce in the US? It's very difficult to draw lines around states when it comes to personal data processing. So what's next? I would hope and keep my fingers crossed that in the US we do see some congressional action within the next 2 years. Obviously election cycles have a lot to do with that. I know that coming online, you see laws, for example, the Brazilian version really of the kind of the GDPR will be effective sometime in 2020. I believe they pushed the effective date out till August. And I think you will see a lot of different countries that are following more along the European model of GDPR. Clearly some of the, for different companies that I deal with, they may be subject to specific laws like HIPAA, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act for financial information, HIPAA, of course, being for protected health information. So I'll rely on you guys to review, obviously, those specific laws that may be subject to what your particular business model is. So again, maybe this should be up front, really is to test where you are from a privacy perspective. What is your privacy maturity? I think here's some questions that you need to ask. You need to ask about your organization and your practices. So again, I'm not going to read these to you. What I would like to do is allow time for questions at the end, and then encourage you to go back through some of these materials. And again, take these, customize them to your organization, to whatever your mission is, but absolutely do not ignore these issues. What I don't want anyone attending this program to end up being a headline like we showed in the front part of the presentation. So with that, I think we'll open it up for questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that, Michael. And now we are going to move on to questions here. So just take maybe a couple seconds to formulate your questions. We've been getting in a lot of questions already, so we can go ahead and start answering the ones that have come in. And just a reminder, you can use the chat box to ask us any questions you have about this presentation. So something that keeps coming up a lot that we've seen and read during this presentation is around password management. So Michael, Kirsten, can you talk generally about password management and how often should you change passwords, for example?
First, I think you need to go back to the assessment part. Which is how sensitive is your data? Because you really do not want to, because password changes can be disruptive. And so I think most companies, most large companies that do have access to some sensitive personal data and systems, remember, it's not just like a database, but if someone can get into your systems, excuse me, then they can move around laterally. And so I think you need to do the security assessment. I think a good rule of thumb is, every 90 days. If that seems like too much based on the type of data that you have, then, I think twice a year. But I would start with every 90 days. I think there are, some good password management solutions out there. What I've seen in the larger organizations is we don't have password management solutions. What we do have is actually an ever-increasing list of password requirements. So my own passwords, for example, at Symantec are now twice as long as they used to be. They contain twice as many special characters. And so, when you get to that stage, it may be safer to have a password management solution. I see a lot of different questions popping up here. So
I will add on to that to say that an important consideration, if you are large enough to have an IT person or an IT team, that treating their passwords that provide access to your full networks and a higher level authority are more important to manage than the lower level folks who are probably not accessing as much data and don't have as much risk for being able to create a weakness in your network. So consider the tiers and how careful you need to be, but you also don't want people keeping all of their passwords on a Post-it note on their bulletin board.
Yeah, and I see a follow-up question coming in on and this is actually a very good question. If you have folks changing their password every 60 days, then the more likely it is somebody's going to write it on a sticky note and put it up on their screen. That is a very valid concern. And I do think that, like I said, it needs to be right-sized to your organization. So as Kirsten was mentioning, it's really, certainly I know internally for our organization, it's a lot more important from an IT systems level to secure those systems than necessarily the individual access. So I think just keep that in mind.
Great. And to build on that, how do multi-factor authentication and digital passwords interact, digital password managers interact?
Visual password managers, I'm would be out of my depth on
digital password managers.
So usually, two-factor authentication refers to the idea that you need two pieces of information to log into something or to get access to something. Typically, that's like you need your password plus a separate code. So for example, here at Symantec, I have my really long password, just like Michael does, but to get into certain systems, I also have to enter a token code, and that is delivered to me on a separate device. Without both of those, I can't get in. That way, if someone were to compromise my password, but they don't have my token code, they still can't get in. Where you see this in day-to-day life is you try and log into your 401k or your 403b, and you log in, and then it says, okay, we're sending a security code to your cell phone, and then you have to enter that as well. That's two-factor authentication. So typically a password manager will handle remembering your users' passwords for you, but they will not provide the second factor authentication. That will come in a different route. And two-factor authentication really is one of the best ways to provide a higher level of security to whatever's behind those passwords.
Excellent. All right. So seeing some more questions coming in, we're going to do our best to get to those. But I think what would be a really great recap are the top 3 things that small, medium nonprofits should focus on security-wise in the next 3 months.
Well, I think for me, it's having, no matter how informal, having some sort of written program, within your organization, and that's why. And I do apologize. I think, I wanted to get through some of this text real fast, and we did skip through a lot of slides. But knowing that, this material is available to you, go back to the FIPPs, go back to some of the questionnaires, and really determine, what can I use in my organization. But I would encourage you to use something for several reasons. First, you're raising awareness. You're raising, sort of the guard against being subject to, bad actors and some of these phishing attacks, et cetera, we've talked about. Second, you have a better story to tell as an organization. So when someone asks you, what are you doing to secure my data, and you're probably going to get these questions more often, you have a story to tell. There are an awful lot of ad hocs, on that survey. We're just kind of ad hoc. I totally get it because of size, mission, lack of resources. But there's some very simple things that you can do to where that doesn't need to be your answer next time. And so that's why we've kind of rushed through some of these, but because the data it's towards the end of these slides is more condensed. But really would encourage you, and I hope that some of that is useful to take and kind of create your own right size, be it, again, questionnaires, privacy by design process, vendor assessments, but do not ignore it. And then I think obviously I've seen several questions about third party doing security assessments. It clearly that depends on your economic ability to go out and pay third parties. I think even having a single individual, it is very important to have an in-house security resource. And then I think that individual would then be the best person to assess your environment and determine when a third party is needed.
Excellent. Let's see, another question here is, how do you get your organization, specifically like staff and volunteers, to adopt these policies? What best practices do you have for this?
Well, I can speak from my own example. I mean, you cannot get a project, a product, a service approved without having gone through certain steps and provided certain information. And certainly, privacy is not the only compliance assessment we do, but privacy is a big part of it. And so you hate to create bottlenecks in the organization. I get that, but this is a pretty important area. And so having it as part of your formal approval process, some measure of a privacy assessment, I think is the easiest and most upfront way to do it. I think
just add to that.
Then training is important.
Yeah, training, and I was even going to say many nonprofits are mission driven, and frequently the principles of privacy and security tie in well to mission-driven organizations. So creating a sense of personal accountability for security and privacy in volunteers and staff, that creates just that extra level of awareness. So a key privacy principle is accountability, and it's basically the idea that every employee, every volunteer, every person who's interacting with any form of personal data takes personal responsibility to protect that data in the way they would want their own data protected. Typically your volunteers, they're there for a reason, and it's not to be unhelpful. So if you can tap into that desire to help your organization and relate it to privacy and security, you're apt to get more buy-in. And chances are you're helping folks in their regular life as well, because privacy and security doesn't end with your business. I was thinking about all these password questions we're getting, and one password risk is that humans use the same password over and over and over again. And so if your employee or your volunteer used a password on some unsecure site in the world that they took a quiz on and then reuse it again as their login to your donor database, that's a risk for your organization. But it's one that you can mitigate by training employees not to reuse passwords, not just at home, but in real life. Not just at work, but in real life. So training and tapping into the emotional and personal aspects of privacy has always been my most successful route at getting people to care about what seems like a very bland and technical issue.
Great. Another question here around, is there an extra layer of security needed if I'm collecting donations? Let's say on my website, for example. Any like extra security that is needed to protect that information?
Well, I think it's going to depend on how you're collecting those donations, and obviously, I think most instances I've seen people go to third-party processors, and so I think I can imagine sort of a homegrown collection, but again, Kirsten, maybe that's more common in a nonprofit, but I think most third-party payment processors certainly are going to be compliant with the credit card industry standards, and I think again you just have to do an assessment of what third parties you're looking to utilize.
And likewise, make sure that whoever has access to the financial end of that from your organization is well trained. So you may be using PayPal to collect your donations, but who has access to your PayPal account? How is it tied to your bank? And do they know to question any changes that might come up or any unusual transactions they might see on there?
Yeah, this is an area where and I think you've seen it in the headlines, where some of your biggest threats, could potentially come internally. Just making sure that you limit access, and that you have some sort of, login verification. You keep logs of who does log in. I think having internal controls is just as important.
All right, and so let's see. We keep getting a lot of questions around password management. So I think maybe just reiterating two-factor, multi-factor authentication, and what are some just good best practices to ensure that that's deployed at your organization?
Yeah, I keep seeing questions about password managers. And I think, I'm not to speak for Michael, but we hesitate to answer those directly because it really depends on the password manager you're using. I can speak to a past experience I had at a small organization without budget for much of anything, less than full-time IT person, no designated privacy person, less than full-time operational person. And under that kind of resource constraint, password managers make a lot of sense. As long as you're using one from a well-known vendor, and well-known, I'm talking like Google, Apple, LastPass, those are the big guys who have an incentive to properly protect your stuff and whose password managers are well-designed and vetted. Data is typically stored locally, so they don't know your password. All they're doing is saving it in an encrypted format so that you can recall it. The bigger risk is, again, that somebody, say, uses Google Chrome's password manager but leaves themselves logged in somewhere with a Post-it note and their password handy. Someone can then access their account and see all of their passwords. So you always need to consider what can go wrong in any scenario. But certainly, this is just a personal opinion. Using a password manager is better than having a Post-it note of passwords or reusing the same password on every site you visit so that you don't forget it.
All right, so that's all the time we have right now for questions. Lots of really great questions. Thank you to our audience for sharing those. And I know this is a lot of content to cover. So again, Michael and Kirsten, thank you so much for answering those questions. And there will be a replay of this webinar in addition to slides, so you can go back and take your time and really let this content sit in and get more familiar, because it's a lot. There's a lot to remember, and this is all really important stuff to ensure the security and protection of your really valuable data. So let's see here. With that then, knowing we covered a lot of different content here, I'd love if you can share in the chat box just one thing you learned in today's webinar, some takeaway, so that other attendees can also kind of look at what were some of those high-level takeaways and consider that for themselves. And we want to make sure these webinars are really valuable for you. We do them for our community. So if you can, please help us complete our post-event survey. That feedback really helps us prepare and present content in the future. And then of course, please follow us on social media. We're on all the social channels, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And you'll hear about this webinar recording when it's posted as well, but you'll also get an email. And then of course we've got more resources on the TechSoup blog, blog.techsoup.org.
I've got a comment if I may. I see so many comments. I see so many comments on the copier example. And just my life is now complete.
Well, excellent. You guys made Michael's day.
Thank you.
I love that. All right. So yeah, keep those comments, those takeaways coming in there. And also just note we've got some upcoming webinars. One on August 15th. It's a Public Good App House Voting Apps demo. And then on the 27th, raise more money by automating the right message at the right time. With giving season just around the corner here, you're not going to want to miss this webinar. And you can see all of our archived webinars at TechSoup.org/community-events. And TechSoup courses. So these are some additional resources for all you change makers on the line here. It's a social learning platform that provides nonprofits and libraries with just-in-time solutions-based training. There's also other services that TechSoup offers to help your nonprofit better implement and manage your technology. So from emergency tech support to strategic planning and fully managed IT services, our offerings are designed to meet the needs of all types of organizations. All right, and just a reminder, it's a great time to take what you learned in this webinar today by visiting and learning more about our Symantec offerings for your nonprofit. So there's a list here, as you can see on your screen, of what some of those offerings are. But for full details, please do go to TechSoup.org/Symantec-catalog. And with that, thank you so much again to Symantec, to Michael and Kirsten for sharing your time, for sharing your knowledge with us today. And we look forward to seeing you all soon again at another webinar. Have a great rest of your day and evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.